There was a time when David might have cared. A time when a sideways glance from Rachel across a crowded room could light him up, or set him on fire. But that time had long passed. At 40, David had lived enough to know the difference between love and performance, passion and provocation. And lately, Rachel had made their relationship feel more like a performance than a partnership. It started subtly. Little changes in how she dressed for casual outings, more revealing, more daring, more intentional. David noticed. She was undeniably beautiful, always had been. But this wasn't about her expressing confidence or reclaiming herself. No, this was something different. It was about reaction. She wanted him to notice, and more importantly, she wanted him to respond. He did neither. Rachel, 38, had always been self-assured, bold even. But there was something calculating behind her charm lately. The way she laughed a bit too long at other men's jokes, the way her eyes lingered just a second too long on waiters, bartenders, even strangers at gas stations. It was always when David was there. Always when he could see. One night they went to a friend's party, a casual event, nothing fancy. But Rachel showed up dressed like it was a red carpet gala. David, in his calm and reserved manner, simply smiled and told her she looked beautiful. She barely acknowledged it. At the party, she floated through the room like a queen holding court, her laughter loud, her glances sharp. David stood with a few friends by the kitchen, sipping whiskey, observing. Then he saw it, Rachel leaning in too close to a tall man near the patio doors, her fingers casually grazing his forearm as she laughed at something he said. The man looked pleased. She glanced over her shoulder, making sure David was watching. And he was. But not the way she wanted him to be. There was no tightening of his jaw. No clenched fists. No dramatic scene. Just the faintest shake of his head and the quiet realization settling into his chest like a final puzzle piece clicking into place. This wasn't love. This wasn't connection. This was manipulation. A game. A test. He'd passed. But not in the way Rachel wanted. Later that night, as they drove home in silence, David looked out the window and thought about all the little moments that had led them here. The gaslighting. The guilt trips. The mind games disguised as jokes. He had tolerated it all, thinking maybe it was just a rough patch. But now, the truth was undeniable. Rachel wasn't seeking reassurance or love, she was seeking control. And David had finally seen through it. She thought making him jealous would spark something in him. She didn't realize it would extinguish whatever flame was left. He was done. It happened on a Tuesday evening, the kind of quiet weeknight when nothing in particular is supposed to happen. David was on the couch, a book in one hand, the soft murmur of jazz floating from his speakers. The air was calm, but something in the way Rachel moved that evening signaled a storm brewing. She was dressed again like she was heading out for cocktails, though she told him it was just a quick dinner with a girlfriend. A name she'd used before, always conveniently vague, always untraceable. She lingered by the mirror longer than usual, adjusting her blouse, reapplying lipstick she'd already perfected. David noticed. He didn't say a word. As she left, she said something flippant, tossed like a bone toward a dog. "Don't wait up," she said over her shoulder, her tone light but deliberately detached. David simply nodded without looking up. But behind that stillness, a shift was happening. He'd once spent nights pacing when she was out late, wondering where she was, who she was with. He'd obsessed over texts that didn't come, apologies that never felt sincere, questions she shrugged off. Not anymore. When the door closed behind her, he closed the book, sat still, and listened to the silence. And in that stillness, the realization settled in with sobering clarity, he didn't care where she was tonight. Not out of spite, not because he didn't love her once, but because he was finally seeing things as they were, not how he wanted them to be. David didn't hate Rachel. That would have made it easier. Hate would have given him a place to pour all the confusion, the disappointment, the unanswered questions. But what he felt now wasn't hate. It was emptiness. The kind that follows when you finally used up every last ounce of hope you didn't even realize you were still holding on to. He thought back to the man at the party. The one she flirted with so boldly, so transparently. He remembered the way she watched David as she laughed, waiting for his reaction. It hadn't been affection or even attraction she was displaying, it had been performance. A play staged for David's benefit, except he wasn't in the audience anymore. This wasn't love. This was a power game. And he had no interest in competing. He poured himself a glass of bourbon and stepped outside, standing barefoot on the balcony as the city hummed below. The night air was cool against his skin, and for the first time in what felt like years, he felt weightless. It wasn't just the absence of Rachel that felt liberating, it was the absence of confusion. He finally saw her clearly. Rachel was someone who needed attention like oxygen. She didn't just want to be loved, she needed to be desired, envied, pursued. To her, love wasn't a quiet presence, it was a test to be passed, a game to be played, a stage on which she needed to be adored. David, once deeply entangled in her emotional cycles, now found himself outside the web entirely. And with that distance came understanding, he had outgrown her. Not in arrogance, not in bitterness, but in peace. He had learned to find meaning in stability, value in consistency. Rachel still craved drama, still mistook chaos for passion. He realized he had been holding on to the memory of who she used to be, the version of her he fell in love with. But that person didn't exist anymore. Or maybe she never had. Later that evening, Rachel returned home, smelling of wine and perfume, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She glanced at David, sitting quietly with a calm expression, and something in her smirk faltered. She was expecting something else, maybe a hint of jealousy, or at least curiosity. But David just nodded in greeting and returned to his book. She paused, clearly unsettled by his indifference. "You're awfully quiet tonight," she said. "I'm just tired," he replied simply. But the truth was, he wasn't tired in the way she assumed. He wasn't weary from work or drained from the day. He was tired of pretending. Tired of trying to salvage something that had stopped being a relationship and had become a power struggle. He was done with emotional tug-of-wars, with being baited into feeling something on command. That night, as Rachel slept beside him, David stayed awake, watching the ceiling. He thought about the man he used to be in this relationship, the man who tried, who forgave, who compromised even when it hurt. He wasn't that man anymore. And for the first time, he wasn't sad about it. He was free. Not because he had walked away yet, but because emotionally, mentally, and spiritually, he already had. It didn't happen during a dramatic fight. There were no raised voices, no shattered plates, no ultimatums. The moment David made the decision to leave wasn't even loud, it was still, almost quiet enough to miss. But it was real. Solid. Final. They were at a dinner party hosted by one of Rachel's co-workers. A rooftop restaurant, sleek and modern, with panoramic views of the city and carefully curated background music. David had never liked these events, but Rachel insisted they go, insisted more than usual. It was clear she wanted something from this night. David just didn't know what. Not yet. Rachel was radiant, no doubt. She wore a scarlet dress that clung to her body like silk on flame, her eyes smoky with shadow, lips glossed to perfection. She walked into the room like she owned it, scanning faces not to recognize them, but to assess them, like a performer gauging her audience before stepping on stage. David walked beside her in tailored charcoal, unbothered, grounded. He greeted people kindly, shook hands, nodded at small talk. But his attention stayed on her, not out of jealousy, but because he knew something was coming. He could feel it in her energy, the way she thrived under the attention of others tonight, drinking it like wine, tipping her head back just slightly more than usual when she laughed. And then it happened. It was during cocktails, under strings of hanging lights that danced with the breeze. Rachel was laughing, too loudly, with a younger man in a tight-fitted blazer and the kind of over-polished charisma David had learned to spot a mile away. David watched as she leaned in, whispering something to the man that made him chuckle and slide his hand to her lower back. She didn't stop him. She didn't even flinch. And for the first time, David felt nothing. No sting. No embarrassment. No anger. Just an overwhelming sense of clarity. He walked toward them with a glass of still water in hand. Not rushed. Not tense. When Rachel spotted him, her smile faltered for a second, just long enough for David to see the flicker of satisfaction fade into something else. Maybe guilt. Maybe confusion. Maybe even fear. But David didn't raise his voice. He didn't confront the man. Instead, he looked at Rachel the way someone might look at an old photograph, realizing they no longer recognized the person in it. "Rachel," he said calmly, handing her the drink she hadn't asked for, "whatever it is you're looking for. I hope you find it." She blinked. "What do you mean?" He smiled, warm but distant. "I mean, good luck." Then he stepped back. Not out of the room, not dramatically out the door, but emotionally, spiritually, he detached. He was already gone. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Rachel tried to resume her performance, laughing louder, pulling David's arm during conversations as if to pull him back into her orbit. But he remained just out of reach. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't cold. He was just done. When they got home, she asked if he was angry. He shook his head. No. Not angry. Just awake. He went to bed without another word. Rachel stayed up, scrolling her phone, waiting for him to cave, to start the argument, to beg her to explain herself. But David had no interest in explanations. What could she possibly say that would undo what he had seen? What he had finally understood? The next morning, David woke early. He made coffee like always, sat at the table like always, but something in his posture was different. Lighter. There was a stillness about him, like the air after a storm has cleared. Rachel came into the kitchen wearing one of his shirts, trying to act like nothing had changed. "Are we going to talk about last night?" she asked, pouring herself coffee. David looked at her, really looked. She still looked beautiful, undeniably so. But beauty without truth, without respect, had no hold on him anymore. "There's nothing to talk about," he said gently. "I saw what I needed to see." Rachel frowned. "It was just harmless flirting. You know that, right?" David didn't flinch. "Maybe it was. But that's not the point." "Then what is?" He set his mug down and stood, calm and composed. "The point is, I'm not here to compete for attention. I'm not going to fight to be seen by someone who deliberately tries to make me feel small, hoping I'll react. That's not love. That's manipulation. And I'm not interested in playing games I didn't agree to." She reached out to stop him, but he was already walking away. Not just from the conversation, but from the relationship, from the emotional weight she'd been placing on his shoulders for far too long. He grabbed a bag and began packing, not in a rage, not as a weapon, but as a quiet act of self-respect. Rachel pleaded then. Apologized. Cried. But David had already forgiven her, because he had nothing left inside to keep him angry. And when the anger is gone, and there's only peace, that's when you know it's truly over. He paused at the door one last time and looked back at her, not with bitterness, but with finality. "Take care of yourself, Rachel." Then he left. No slamming doors. No dramatic speeches. Just the silence of a man reclaiming his peace. Rachel had always considered herself a woman in control. She knew how to charm a room, how to twist silence into suspense, and how to use a well-timed smile like a weapon. Throughout her life, she had mastered the art of getting what she wanted, sometimes through sincerity, sometimes through subtle manipulation. With David, it had always been a delicate dance. Push too hard, he'd pull back. Pull away too far, he'd come chasing. Or so she thought. In the days following that dinner party, Rachel waited for the inevitable, the confrontation, the begging, the heartbreak, the apology, something. She had seen relationships bend and snap under far less. But with David, there was no storm. No phone call. No desperate texts or messages sent in the middle of the night. Just silence. Profound, haunting silence. At first, she dismissed it as his version of sulking. He was probably just licking his wounds, she told herself. Giving him space would make him realize how much he missed her, how incomplete life felt without her presence filling up the room. But days turned into a week, and David remained gone, not physically unreachable, but emotionally disconnected. He didn't block her number. He didn't curse her out or throw blame around. He just stopped engaging. She sent a casual message. "Hey, thinking about you. Can we talk?" No reply. Then another. "I'm sorry for how that night went. I know things got weird." Still nothing. By the time a week passed, Rachel's carefully curated confidence began to fray. The silence wasn't a tactic. It was a decision. And that terrified her more than any fight ever could. She stopped by his place under the pretense of returning a forgotten jacket. She stood outside his door, rehearsing the right mix of casual and contrite, hoping to reopen the chapter she had so effortlessly tried to flip past. But David didn't answer. His car was gone. The windows dark. A neighbor walking her dog offered a casual, "He went away for a few days. Said he needed peace." Peace. That word echoed in her mind as she walked back to her car, her heels clicking against the concrete like accusations. David hadn't run away from her, he had walked away from chaos. And what shook Rachel the most was not just that he left, but that he didn't look back. For years, she had misread his silence as passivity, his patience as permission. She thought that his calm demeanor was something she could mold and manipulate, like clay in her hands. But what she had mistaken for weakness was actually strength. David didn't shout because he didn't need to. He didn't chase because he finally knew his worth. Rachel sat alone that night in the living room they once shared, surrounded by echoes of conversations that now felt impossibly distant. She scrolled through old photos on her phone, smiling snapshots of vacations, birthdays, ordinary days that had felt extraordinary simply because he was in them. His presence had been a quiet constant in her life, and she had taken it for granted. She thought about the way he had smiled that final evening, not bitterly, not sarcastically, but with a calm so complete it cut through her like glass. He hadn't needed revenge. He hadn't needed to prove anything. He had simply let go. And in doing so, he stripped her of the control she believed she always held. In desperation, she tried calling again. This time, her voice cracked on the voicemail. "David, please call me back. I miss you. I think I messed everything up." Still, no response. She began replaying every interaction in her mind, dissecting moments she once saw as harmless. The flirtation, the games, the subtle digs disguised as jokes. What she used to consider harmless tests now looked like wounds she had inflicted for sport. And David, he had been bleeding quietly, never once showing her the pain. Now he was gone, and she realized she'd mistaken endurance for indifference. Rachel showed up at his office once, unannounced. The receptionist looked uncomfortable but polite. "Mr. Carter isn't seeing visitors," she said firmly. "He's asked not to be disturbed." Not even a glance. Not even a second of curiosity to see who had come. She walked away that afternoon with her pride shattered. All the things she thought made her irreplaceable, her beauty, her wit, her allure, meant nothing now. Because none of them had been rooted in respect. And David had finally decided to stop accepting less than he deserved. It was in the quiet hours, when the lights were off and her reflection stared back at her from a dark window, that the truth fully hit. She hadn't just lost him. She'd driven him away with her own hands. What she thought was power had actually been poison. And now, the man who had once looked at her like she hung the stars no longer looked at all. There was no villain to blame. No affair. No betrayal beyond the emotional neglect and manipulation she had orchestrated. And that was the hardest part. She hadn't lost him to another woman. She had lost him to herself. David never made a grand announcement about his departure. There was no dramatic social media post, no farewell letter left on a counter. He simply lived, quietly, intentionally, and without the emotional turbulence that had once clouded his days. In choosing to walk away, he had reclaimed the space in his life that had been steadily consumed by chaos. And now, in the absence of manipulation, he discovered something far more valuable: peace. At first, adjusting to life alone had felt strange. Mornings were no longer filled with passive-aggressive comments over coffee or tension simmering beneath polite conversation. The house felt empty, but not in a mournful way, more like a canvas finally cleared, waiting for something genuine to be painted onto it. David began to fill that space with things that nourished him. He picked up journaling again, started hiking on weekends, and even joined a book club in the city, something he'd always wanted to do but never found the emotional energy for before. Every so often, Rachel would try to reach out. A message on his birthday. Hope you're doing well around the holidays. Once, she even sent him a photo of their favorite restaurant, as if nostalgia could rebuild a bridge that had long since burned. But David never replied. Not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. Responding would invite confusion, and he had worked too hard to clear the fog from his life. There was no anger left in him. In truth, David hoped Rachel found what she was looking for, whatever validation or thrill she thought she needed. But he no longer felt responsible for her journey. He had learned, sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do for someone who keeps hurting you is to remove yourself from their reach. Friends who had seen him endure the slow erosion of that relationship began to notice the change. His shoulders sat differently now, more relaxed, less burdened. There was a stillness in his eyes that hadn't been there before, the kind that only comes when a person stops trying to win a war they were never meant to fight in the first place. And then came the moment that confirmed what he had already known in his heart: he was truly free. He ran into an old acquaintance at a cafe, someone who had once known both him and Rachel socially. They exchanged pleasantries before the topic turned, gently, toward the breakup. "I heard Rachel's not taking it well," the man said, stirring his coffee. "She's been talking about you a lot lately. Says she didn't expect you to actually leave. Thought you'd come back eventually." David smiled, not smugly, not triumphantly, but peacefully. "I didn't leave to teach her a lesson," he said. "I left to teach myself one. That I deserve a life where love doesn't come with conditions or games." And that was the truth. David's choice hadn't been about revenge. It wasn't about punishing Rachel or proving a point. It was about preserving his dignity. About refusing to spend another day trying to meet the ever-moving target of someone else's insecurities. In the months that followed, David didn't rush into a new relationship. He wasn't looking to fill a void, because there wasn't one. For the first time in years, he felt whole on his own. And he knew, when love did come again, it would be from a place of abundance, not lack. Rachel, on the other hand, was left with echoes of what she had, what she lost, and what she never truly appreciated until it was gone. She had played her games believing that David's silence was a sign of weakness. But in the end, it was the strength of that silence that spoke loudest of all.